all set in motion by a homeless woman's desperate decision to seek shelter in an abandoned subway station she stumbled upon while evading city authorities. A forgotten underground platform in the heart of New York City that would eventually bring historians from the Metropolitan Museum to her makeshift bed, trigger emergency preservation orders from the State Historical Society, and ultimately reveal a concealed Prohibition-era train car containing bootlegger fortune that had remained untouched for nearly a century. A discovery that would rewrite American criminal history and transform one woman's story of destitution into an extraordinary legacy of historical revelation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Eliza Winters, a 34-year-old former architectural photographer whose world collapsed when a devastating apartment fire consumed not just her home, but her entire livelihood. The woman who once captured stunning images for Architectural Digest and National Geographic was about to make a desperate choice that seemed like the final mistake in a series of catastrophic life turns. Eliza stared at the eviction notice taped to her temporary housing door, the November morning air cutting through her worn jacket as she fumbled with the key to the modest studio apartment in Queens. The stark white paper with its official letterhead and legal terminology represented the final countdown of a financial disaster that had been building for months. Ever since the fire had destroyed her apartment building 6 months ago, along with all her professional equipment, backup drives, and portfolio materials, her once promising career had spiraled into a desperate struggle for survival. The numbers were merciless in their precision. Outstanding debt $37,800. Current bank balance $42. 17 days until forced eviction 7. Each figure represented a piece of the life she had built over 12 years of professional photography, now reduced to cold calculations that showed no mercy for talent, misfortune, or the devastating uninsured losses that had consumed everything she'd worked to achieve. Inside the apartment, Eliza spread the collection of past due notices across the small folding table. The same table where she had once edited photographs of multi-million-dollar homes and iconic buildings, planning her next international assignment. The harsh fluorescent light overhead illuminated a financial catastrophe that seemed impossible to escape. Rent payments 3 months behind totaling $6,300, replacement equipment costs exceeding $22,000, and credit card debt accumulated during her displacement reaching $9,500. The irony wasn't lost on Eliza that a woman who had spent her career capturing the beauty and stability of architectural spaces was now completely unable to secure her own shelter. Her specialized expertise in architectural photography, once valued by major publications and wealthy clients, had become professionally irrelevant without the expensive equipment and portfolio needed to demonstrate her capabilities to potential clients. Eliza's photography had always focused on finding beauty in structure and form, capturing the intersection of human design and functional space in ways that revealed the artistic intentions behind architectural choices. Her eye for composition and light had earned her recognition in the competitive field of architectural photography, with spreads in design magazines and collaborations with prominent architects who valued her ability to translate their three-dimensional visions into compelling two-dimensional images. The fire had started on a Tuesday afternoon in May, reportedly from faulty wiring in the building's aging electrical system. Eliza had been away on a short assignment photographing the historic restoration project in Connecticut when her neighbor called with the devastating news. By the time she returned to New York, the 5-story brownstone where she had lived for 8 years was a charred shell, with emergency services still pumping water into smoldering hot spots that flared up periodically. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What the fire department captain couldn't convey in that moment was how completely the disaster would dismantle not just Eliza's physical possessions, but the entire infrastructure of her professional existence and financial security. The loss extended far beyond personal belongings to the specialized tools that enabled her livelihood: 3 professional camera bodies, 7 premium architectural lenses, lighting equipment, calibrated monitors, a custom editing workstation, and most devastatingly, the portable hard drives containing her entire photographic archive and client history. The insurance that should have protected her had proven woefully inadequate. Her renter's policy, which she had maintained faithfully for years, included a technology rider that covered personal electronics, but specifically limited professional equipment. Coverage to $5,000, a fraction of the $27,000 replacement cost for her specialized gear. The policy exclusions appeared in subsection clauses that Eliza had never fully understood, creating grounds for minimal compensation despite years of premium payments. The rejection letter from Metropolitan Insurance remained in Eliza's tattered messenger bag, its legal language explaining how the business use exclusion had voided coverage for most of her equipment, despite the fact that she had specified her profession when purchasing the policy. The investigation had determined that her photography equipment qualified as professional business assets rather than personal property, providing legal justification for denying full replacement value when she most desperately needed it. Eliza's attempts to maintain her client relationships without proper equipment had proven nearly impossible. The architectural firms and publications that had previously commissioned her work expected technical perfection and distinctive style that couldn't be achieved with borrowed equipment or smartphone cameras. The specialized tilt-shift lenses that had enabled her signature perspective corrections and depth of field manipulations cost $2,200 each equipment. She couldn't begin to replace with the $5,000 insurance settlement she had received. The part-time positions she had managed to secure after the fire provided minimal income that couldn't address the mounting debt. Working 25 hours weekly as a barista at an artisanal coffee shop for $15 per hour generated only $1,500 monthly before taxes, while weekend shifts taking headshots at a budget portrait studio added another $800 to her income, creating total monthly earnings of approximately $2,300 that barely covered rent and essential expenses, let alone replacement equipment or accumulated debt. The temporary housing that Eliza had secured through a city emergency program had seemed like a lifeline when offered 3 days after the fire. The studio apartment in Queens had provided basic shelter during the initial crisis, but the 6-month housing assistance was now ending, with no possibility of extension given overwhelming demand for the limited program resources. The monthly rent of $2,100 for even the most basic apartment in the city's overheated housing market exceeded what she could afford on her current income, creating an unsustainable situation that had led to the eviction notice now threatening to eliminate her last connection to stability. Selling her remaining photography equipment would have been the logical solution, except that the few pieces she had salvaged represented essential tools for rebuilding her career if she could ever secure enough funds to complement them with the additional gear required for professional work. The Canon 5D camera body that had been in her car during the fire was worth approximately $1,800 on the used market, but without companion lenses and editing equipment, it was both too valuable to abandon and insufficient for professional assignments. Eliza's daily routine had become a careful choreography of survival, managing profound loss while simultaneously addressing practical challenges that required constant attention. Her mornings began at 5:30 a.m. with job searches and application submissions targeting any position that might utilize her visual skills and attention to detail. The remainder of her day was divided between her part-time work commitments and evening hours, spent researching emergency housing programs, portfolio reconstruction options, and grant resources that might provide alternatives to homelessness. The emotional toll of simultaneous professional loss and housing crisis had created what Dr. Michael Reeves, a counselor at the Community Crisis Center, identified as catastrophic disruption trauma that made recovery from either challenge significantly more difficult. You're processing the loss of your professional identity while simultaneously facing the loss of housing security and financial stability. Dr. Reeves had explained during their weekly sessions funded through a victim services program. Each loss reinforces the others, creating a cycle that can feel impossible to break. The isolation that accompanied Eliza's circumstances had been unexpected and difficult to manage. Colleagues from architectural firms expressed sympathy but were located primarily in other cities or countries, making their support meaningful but not immediately helpful for addressing housing and financial challenges. Most painful was Eliza's recognition that the disaster had eliminated not just her livelihood, but also her sense of professional purpose during the worst financial crisis she had ever experienced. The creative practice that had previously provided both income and personal fulfillment had become a painful reminder of loss, leaving Eliza to navigate complex decisions while processing grief that made concentration and rational planning significantly more difficult. The bills that continued arriving months after the fire served as recurring reminders of both her professional collapse and her impossible financial situation. Statements from credit card companies, temporary storage facilities, and medical providers created a paper trail of her desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of stability, now transformed into financial obligations that threatened to eliminate any possibility of recovery. The $200 that remained in Eliza's checking account after paying essential utilities represented the complete extent of her liquid assets money that needed to last until her next paychecks while also covering transportation to work and basic necessities. The amount was simultaneously everything she had and completely inadequate for addressing any unexpected expense or opportunity that might require immediate financial commitment. Eliza's morning routine of reviewing job listings and housing options had become a ritual of managed desperation, each day requiring careful calculation of which bills could be delayed, which opportunities might be worth pursuing, and which aspects of her former life needed to be abandoned to focus on immediate survival. The woman who had once confidently navigated complex architectural spaces, capturing perfect compositions, was now overwhelmed by the complexity of prioritizing competing financial obligations that all seemed equally urgent and impossible to address. The coffee shop where Eliza worked part-time had become a daily reminder of the irony in her situation. Surrounded by affluent customers who casually spent $7 on specialty drinks while discussing renovation projects and design choices, she was completely unable to identify anything in her own life that could be sold for sufficient funds to address her housing crisis. Her expertise remained intact, but its commercial value had evaporated in circumstances that required immediate cash rather than specialized knowledge. But it was during one of these desperate mornings, after her shift ended at the coffee shop, that Eliza's phone displayed a notification that would change the trajectory of her story. An alert from the transit authority announced emergency system maintenance requiring closure of several infrequently used subway stations, including the abandoned City Hall station, a magnificent architectural relic from 1904 that had been closed to the public since 1945 due to platform design limitations that couldn't accommodate modern train lengths. The announcement mentioned that maintenance crews would be accessing the station through a service entrance on Worth Street, information that caught Eliza's attention in ways she couldn't immediately explain. Perhaps it represented an alternative to the streets that seemed increasingly likely to become her only housing option. As she stared at the notice, Eliza realized she was looking at an opportunity that was either completely irrational or potentially transformative. And she no longer had enough left to lose to let fear make the decision for her. The transit authority notification about the City Hall station had appeared at the worst possible moment, when Eliza's morning routine of reviewing eviction documents and job rejections had reached its most desperate point. She stared at the notice on her phone screen, the temporary closure of subway stations representing exactly the type of administrative detail most New Yorkers would ignore, but which resonated differently with someone facing imminent homelessness. City Hall Station was legendary among urban explorers and architecture enthusiasts, a crown jewel of underground design with soaring tiled arches, elegant skylights, and ornate brass fixtures that reflected the optimistic spirit of early 20th century public works. Designed by renowned architects Hines and Lafarge, the station had served as the showpiece of New York's first subway line, featuring Guastavino vaulted ceilings, leaded glass skylights, and elaborate Romanesque revival elements that elevated public transportation to architectural art. The memory of seeing photographs of the station in architectural history books felt both precious and painful as Eliza enlarged the transit authority notice on her phone screen. The station, built in 1904, according to the announcement, showed the distinctive architectural features of the city, beautiful movement that had influenced American civic design during the early 20th century. Despite being closed to regular passenger service since 1945, the station had been maintained as an historical landmark and was occasionally opened for special tours organized by the Transit Museum. But recognizing the station's architectural significance only emphasized the impossibility of Eliza's current circumstances. Her knowledge of architectural history and photography had trained her to appreciate the historical and aesthetic value of such spaces. Yet this knowledge felt mockingly irrelevant when she couldn't afford to maintain her own modest housing, let alone pay for one of the exclusive guided tours that would allow legal access to the abandoned station. The practical challenges were immediately obvious, even from the limited information in the notice. The station had been closed to the public for nearly 80 years, with access tightly controlled by transit authorities concerned about liability and security issues. Unauthorized entry would constitute trespassing on government property, potentially resulting in criminal charges if she were discovered. More concerning was the physical danger of navigating an active subway system, with electrified third rails and trains continuing to pass through portions of the abandoned station. The station's connection to the active 6 train line meant that Metropolitan Transportation Authority personnel and NYPD transit officers regularly patrolled the area, making long-term occupation extremely risky. The skills that had made Eliza valuable as a photographer, attention to detail, spatial awareness, and compositional understanding, had no apparent application to the overwhelming practical challenges of finding shelter in an abandoned subway station. Yet something about the notice continued to capture Eliza's attention in ways that transcended logical assessment of the challenges involved. Perhaps it was the connection to her previous work photographing historic architecture, when her future had seemed filled with possibilities for creative projects that combined her technical expertise with her passion for architectural history. Or perhaps it was the desperate recognition that conventional approaches to her housing crisis had proved completely inadequate, making an unconventional decision seem worth considering despite obvious risks. The maintenance was scheduled to begin the following Monday, exactly 3 days before the eviction deadline that would force Eliza from her temporary housing. The timing created an impossible choice between using her last financial resources for a few nights in a hotel, seeking unauthorized shelter in city infrastructure that might offer more sustainable protection if she could gain access undetected. The rational decision was obviously to preserve her remaining money for food and transportation, while pursuing emergency shelter services that might become available with persistent applications. But rationality hadn't prevented the catastrophic fire that had consumed Eliza's equipment and portfolio. It hadn't protected her from insurance policy exclusions or the sudden collapse of her career prospects. The careful, logical approaches that had defined her previous decision-making had proved completely inadequate for addressing the extraordinary circumstances created by disasters beyond her control. Perhaps those same careful approaches were equally inadequate for recognizing opportunities that might exist outside conventional expectations. Eliza spent the remainder of that day researching the City Hall station's layout and access points, discovering information published by urban exploration enthusiasts and historical preservation websites. While official access was strictly controlled, several articles mentioned maintenance entrances and emergency exits that connected the abandoned platform to active portions of the transit system. The station's unique position as both historical landmark and closed transit facility created administrative complexities that resulted in multiple jurisdictional boundaries and oversight responsibilities. The information painted a picture of a space in transition, neither fully abandoned nor actively utilized, existing in a bureaucratic limbo that created both challenges and opportunities for someone desperate enough to consider unconventional shelter options. The station's location beneath the intersection of Center Street and Chambers Street placed it within walking distance of several 24-hour establishments where Eliza could access restrooms and basic facilities if she could establish a temporary presence in the abandoned platform area. More intriguingly, Eliza's research revealed that the City Hall station contained several auxiliary rooms that had originally served as mechanical spaces, storage areas, and staff facilities when the station was operational. These secondary spaces received less attention during official inspections and maintenance visits, potentially offering more secure areas for temporary occupation if she could gain initial access to the main platform. The gap between recognizing potential shelter and having the means to safely access and utilize such a space felt insurmountable. Yet another reminder of how completely her circumstances had changed since the fire. But as Eliza continued researching the station's layout and security protocols, she began to recognize connections between the building's design and her own professional background that might provide advantages she hadn't initially considered. Her experience photographing historic buildings had included navigating complex structures while carrying equipment and identifying optimal vantage points that were often in overlooked or difficult to access locations. While she had never attempted anything remotely like urban exploration or unauthorized access, the underlying skills of spatial navigation, problem-solving, and careful observation were directly relevant to assessing potential entry points and secure locations within the abandoned station. More significantly, Eliza's photography background included extensive knowledge of lighting conditions and shadow patterns that could help identify times when maintenance entrances might be accessible with minimal risk of detection. Her familiarity with architectural documentation had taught her to recognize service areas and utility access points that were often visually minimized in public spaces, but provided essential access for maintenance personnel, exactly the type of inconspicuous entry points that might allow access to the abandoned platform. But as Eliza continued researching the station's layout and security protocols, she began to recognize connections between the building's design and her own professional background that might provide advantages she hadn't initially considered. Her experience photographing historic buildings had included navigating complex structures while carrying equipment and identifying optimal vantage points that were often in overlooked or difficult to access locations. While she had never attempted anything remotely like urban exploration or unauthorized access, the underlying skills of spatial navigation, problem-solving, and careful observation were directly relevant to assessing potential entry points and secure locations within the abandoned station. More significantly, Eliza's photography background included extensive knowledge of lighting conditions and shadow patterns that could help identify times when maintenance entrances might be accessible with minimal risk of detection. Her familiarity with architectural documentation had taught her to recognize service areas and utility access points that were often visually minimized in public spaces, but provided essential access for maintenance personnel, exactly the type of inconspicuous entry points that might allow access to the abandoned platform. Her graduate studies in architectural history had included research on New York's early subway system, with particular focus on the City Beautiful movement's influence on public infrastructure design during the Progressive era. This specialized knowledge provided crucial insights into the station's original layout and subsequent modifications, potentially revealing access points that might be overlooked by security personnel focused on more obvious entry routes. But recognizing these potential advantages only emphasized the fundamental obstacle of the legal and physical risks involved. Unauthorized access to transit infrastructure carried potential criminal penalties, while the active subway system presented genuine dangers from electrified rails, moving trains, and poor air quality. The mathematical probability of detection was significant, regardless of how carefully she planned her approach. Yet Eliza found herself unable to dismiss the opportunity entirely. Something about the abandoned station had triggered a sense of connection and possibility that felt more authentic than any of the conventional housing opportunities she had been pursuing. Her emergency shelter applications had consistently resulted in waitlist notifications that emphasized overwhelming demand for limited resources. The municipal housing assistance programs required documentation and referrals that created bureaucratic obstacles despite her obvious need. The afternoon brought another round of disappointing responses to recent housing applications. An affordable housing lottery had selected other applicants with higher priority scores. A shared housing opportunity required a security deposit and first month's rent that exceeded her available funds. Even a temporary room sharing arrangement had been awarded to someone who could commit to a longer-term lease than Eliza could guarantee with her uncertain employment situation. Each rejection reinforced Eliza's growing recognition that her housing needs and financial resources didn't align with available opportunities in New York City's brutally competitive housing market. The specialized knowledge that had once provided career security and creative fulfillment was increasingly irrelevant in an economy that valued different qualifications and financial resources. At 34, Eliza was competing against applicants with stronger financial credentials and established rental histories untarnished by an eviction notice. The subtle discrimination that affected her housing prospects was evident in application feedback that emphasized financial stability and rental history rather than immediate need or potential. Most frustrating was the recurring suggestion that Eliza consider relocating to more affordable cities where housing costs might align better with her current income, advice that ignored the financial impossibility of moving when she couldn't afford current living expenses, let alone security deposits, moving costs, and transportation to unfamiliar locations where she had no professional connections or support network. The isolation that had accompanied Eliza's housing crisis was compounded by well-meaning, but ultimately unhelpful advice from friends and former colleagues who didn't understand the practical constraints of her situation. Suggestions to just stay with family for a while ignored the reality that her parents lived in a small retirement community in Arizona that prohibited long-term guests, while her sister's one-bedroom apartment in Boston couldn't accommodate another adult. Recommendations to start a GoFundMe overlooked the fact that such campaigns required extensive social media networks and compelling narratives that could break through the constant flood of similar appeals. Even professional support, while emotionally meaningful, couldn't address the practical challenges of Eliza's circumstances. The career counselor at the Photographers Alliance had offered portfolio review services and networking opportunities. That might eventually lead to assignments, but couldn't provide the immediate equipment replacement and housing stability that Eliza needed to rebuild her professional practice. More complex was Eliza's recognition that accepting certain types of assistance might provide short-term stability while eliminating her independence and sense of agency during a period when regaining control over her circumstances felt essential for emotional recovery. The crisis counseling sessions with Dr. Reeves had emphasized the importance of maintaining aspects of personal autonomy while addressing practical needs, a balance that seemed increasingly difficult to achieve as her options continued to narrow. The evening hours that Eliza now spent researching emergency shelter options and temporary housing programs had become exercises in confronting the inadequacy of social safety nets for people whose circumstances didn't fit standard categories of need. Her income, though insufficient for market-rate housing, exceeded eligibility thresholds for many assistance programs, while her professional background created obstacles to accessing help designed for people with different socioeconomic profiles. Most demoralizing was Eliza's discovery that the housing assistance programs available through local charitable organizations were designed primarily for families with children, veterans, or individuals with documented disabilities categories. That didn't include a single professional woman whose career had been destroyed by an apartment fire. The women's shelters prioritized survivors of domestic violence, while general homeless services were overwhelmed with chronically unhoused individuals with complex needs that took precedence over newly displaced persons like Eliza. The legal aid services available for eviction defense were similarly limited, offering guidance on procedural requirements and timeline extensions, but unable to provide alternatives that would allow Eliza to maintain housing without income sufficient to resume rent payments. The attorney she consulted confirmed that her best option was negotiating terms for voluntary. "What if I use my remaining resources for something completely different?" she had asked Jamal Washington, the nonprofit counselor who had been helping her understand her limited housing options. Instead of trying to delay the inevitable, what if I found shelter outside the conventional system entirely? Jamal's response had been professionally cautious but personally understanding. Sometimes unconventional approaches make sense when conventional solutions aren't working, he had acknowledged. But any alternative needs to be safe enough to prevent trading one crisis for another. The time frame for finding stable housing requires solutions that won't create additional legal or physical dangers while you're rebuilding your life. The conversation had crystallized Eliza's recognition that incremental improvements to her current circumstances weren't sufficient to address the magnitude of her housing crisis. The part-time employment she had been able to secure provided income that was inadequate for maintaining housing costs in New York City, while the wait lists for assistance programs extended months beyond her immediate eviction deadline. Conventional approaches to housing security assumed resources that Eliza simply didn't possess: security deposits, consistent income history, and credit scores unblemished by recent financial catastrophe. The prospect of entering the general shelter system meant abandoning her remaining photography equipment to theft and damage, while navigating environments that were often unsafe for single women and incompatible with maintaining employment. The City Hall station represented something entirely different, an opportunity that could potentially utilize her knowledge of architectural spaces while providing shelter that maintained her dignity and independence. The space aligned with her professional interests and expertise in ways that conventional emergency housing couldn't match. The project would be challenging and uncertain, but it would also be authentic to who she was and what she knew about historic architecture and urban spaces. Yet acknowledging these emotional and professional attractions to the station didn't resolve the fundamental safety obstacles that made such an undertaking seem completely impractical. The $200 in her checking account represented her entire liquid assets, money that needed to cover essential expenses while she continued job searching and navigating her impending eviction. Using those funds for supplies and equipment needed to safely access the abandoned station would eliminate her financial safety net during a period when unexpected expenses could create catastrophic consequences. The risk assessment was daunting regardless of how Eliza analyzed the decision. Attempting to access and shelter in the abandoned station would expose her to legal consequences that could include criminal trespassing charges, while the physical environment presented genuine dangers from an active transit system that wasn't designed for unauthorized human habitation. But as Eliza researched the station's history and access points throughout that week, she began to recognize that every decision available to her involved significant risks and uncertain outcomes. Continuing her current approach of inadequate part-time employment and emergency assistance, applications offered no realistic path to housing stability given the magnitude of her needs and limited availability of services. Entering the general shelter system would provide basic protection from the elements, but expose her to environments where maintaining employment and rebuilding her career would be nearly impossible. Perhaps the choice wasn't between a safe conventional approach and a risky unconventional opportunity, but rather between different types of risks that offered varying potential for maintaining her dignity and professional identity. The station represented a risk that aligned with her professional expertise and personal values, while offering possibilities for temporary shelter that could provide both physical protection and emotional space to rebuild her career. By Saturday evening, exactly 3 days after first seeing the Transit Authority notice, Eliza had made a decision that she couldn't entirely explain through rational analysis. She would attempt to access the City Hall station during the maintenance period and, if successful, establish a temporary shelter in one of the auxiliary spaces while continuing to pursue legitimate housing opportunities. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, representing either the worst possible choice she could make or the first authentic decision since losing everything in the fire. She spent that night studying architectural drawings and historical photographs of the station, identifying potential access routes and secure locations for temporary shelter. For the first time in months, Eliza felt engaged with a challenge that utilized her expertise in architectural spaces and photographic documentation. The woman who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of navigating housing bureaucracy was suddenly energized by the complexity of planning safe access to a beautiful but forbidden underground space. The challenge felt manageable because it required skills she possessed and approaches she understood, even if the specific application was unfamiliar. Most importantly, it felt like moving toward possibilities rather than merely managing decline, taking active steps to address her shelter needs, rather than passively waiting for systems that had repeatedly failed to provide meaningful assistance. On Sunday morning, Eliza visited a camping supply store and spent $83 of her remaining funds on essential items: a compact LED headlamp with multiple brightness settings, a lightweight sleeping bag designed for urban camping, a collapsible water bottle, and basic first aid supplies. She added a small notebook with waterproof pages and several pencils, knowing that documenting the space might provide both practical benefits for navigation and potential material for rebuilding her portfolio if she could capture the station's architectural details. The practical preparations helped focus Eliza's planning while providing tangible steps toward implementing her decision. Each item represented both practical utility and symbolic commitment to her unconventional approach, tools that acknowledged the challenges ahead while providing means to address them through careful preparation rather than reckless improvisation. Monday morning found Eliza positioned near the Worth Street service entrance that had been mentioned in the Transit Authority notice, carrying a small backpack containing her essential supplies and wearing nondescript dark clothing that wouldn't attract attention. She had arrived at 5:30 a.m., timing her approach to coincide with the maintenance crews, Early shift change when the entrance would likely be accessed with minimal security presence. Her research had identified this particular timing as optimal late. Enough that night security would be completing final rounds before shift change, but early enough that morning commuter traffic wouldn't complicate her approach. The psychological preparation had been as important as the practical planning, requiring Eliza to overcome both fear of detection and anxiety about the unfamiliar environment she was attempting to access. The service entrance was marked only by a nondescript metal door set into a retaining wall, with signage limited to small warning notices about unauthorized access and required security credentials. Eliza positioned herself across the street, pretending to check her phone while observing the entrance for patterns of activity that might provide an opportunity. Her photography experience had taught her to watch light and movement patterns, patiently, waiting for optimal moments rather than forcing opportunities through hasty action. At 5:47 a.m., her patience was rewarded when a maintenance van arrived and 3 workers exited, carrying tool bags and equipment cases toward the service entrance. Their conversation about weekend sports results and Monday scheduling created sufficient distraction that Eliza was able to time her approach to coincide with their entry, maintaining casual confidence while staying just close enough to catch the door before it closed automatically behind the last worker. The timing required perfect execution, close enough to prevent the door from latching, but not so close that the workers would notice her following. The moment of decision arrived as the last worker entered, and Eliza moved with deliberate purpose, catching the heavy metal door just before it closed completely. The soft click rather than definitive latch indicated success, and she waited 15 seconds before carefully pulling the door open, just enough to slip inside. The service entrance opened to a narrow concrete corridor illuminated by widely spaced utility lighting that cast alternating pools of harsh brightness and deep shadow. The maintenance crew had already descended a metal staircase at the corridor's end, their voices echoing from below as they discussed the day's work assignments. Eliza waited until the sounds faded before proceeding carefully down the corridor, using her phone's camera to document the layout and potential exit routes, information that might prove crucial if she needed to leave quickly under emergency conditions. The staircase descended 3 levels, each landing marked with faded signage indicating service areas and access restrictions. The air grew noticeably cooler and carried the distinctive smell of underground transit spaces, a combination of concrete dust, electrical systems, and the faint metallic scent of rail infrastructure. Eliza's architectural knowledge helped her interpret the space, recognizing that the successive levels corresponded to different historical phases of the subway system's development. At the bottom of the staircase, the corridor branched in 3 directions, with the freshest footprints, indicating the maintenance crew had taken the center passage. Eliza consulted the station diagram she had memorized, recognizing that the leftmost corridor should connect to auxiliary spaces that had once housed electrical control systems for the original 1904 station. These spaces were less likely to be included in routine maintenance work, potentially providing safer temporary shelter than areas actively being serviced. The decision to turn left represented commitment to her plan, moving away from authorized personnel toward unused sections of the abandoned station. The corridor narrowed and the lighting became more sporadic, with several fixtures non-functional, creating longer stretches of darkness that required using her headlamp on its lowest setting. The walls showed increasing age, with early 20th century tile work replacing the modern concrete of the entrance corridor. After approximately 200 feet, the corridor opened into a small antechamber that had once served as a control room, judging by the remnants of electrical panels and equipment. Mounting brackets still visible on the walls. The space measured approximately 15 by 20 feet, with a ceiling height of about 10 feet, and featured surprisingly intact architectural details from the original station construction, glazed ceramic tile wainscoting in deep green, decorative brass fixtures, and the characteristic arched doorways that defined the city beautiful aesthetic of the original station design. Most importantly, the room showed no signs of recent human activity, no footprints in the dust covering the floor, number modern equipment or tools, no food wrappers or other debris that would indicate regular visits from maintenance personnel. The space appeared to have been bypassed in modern maintenance routines, its original functions made obsolete by newer systems installed elsewhere in the subway network. A heavy metal door on the room's far wall was marked with faded lettering, identifying it as access to the main platform, the spectacular arched public space that had once welcomed New York's first subway passengers. Eliza approached this door cautiously, listening for any sounds of activity before carefully testing the handle. To her surprise, the mechanism turned smoothly, suggesting that while abandoned, the station's internal connections remained functional. The door opened to a short passage that connected directly to the main platform of City Hall Station, and Eliza's first glimpse of the space literally took her breath away. Even in the dim emergency lighting that permanently illuminated the abandoned platform, the architectural magnificence was immediately apparent. Soaring tiled arches stretched overhead, their Guastavino vaulting creating graceful curves that drew the eye upward to skylights that allowed faint natural illumination to filter down from the street level above. The platform itself curved in, a graceful arc that had once allowed passengers to board from both sides, but had ultimately made the station obsolete when longer train cars were introduced that couldn't navigate the tight turn. The walls featured elaborate tile work in deep greens and warm ochres, with brass fixtures and ornate signage that reflected the optimistic civic pride that had informed the station's original design. For a moment, Eliza forgot her desperate circumstances entirely, her photographer's eye automatically assessing light patterns and compositional elements that would capture the space's grandeur. The station was more beautiful than any photograph had suggested, its three-dimensional reality conveying a sense of historical presence and architectural integrity that transcended its abandoned status. But the sound of voices echoing from the opposite end of the platform quickly returned Eliza to her immediate situation. The maintenance crew was working in the main platform area, their tools and voices indicating that they were focused on electrical systems near the former ticket booths. Their presence confirmed that Eliza's chosen auxiliary room was indeed bypassed by current work patterns, potentially providing the secure temporary shelter she had hoped to find. She retreated quickly to the control room, closing the heavy door silently behind her and taking stock of her newfound space. Despite decades of abandonment, the room was surprisingly intact and offered several advantages for temporary shelter: solid walls that provided sound isolation, a single access point that could be monitored, sufficient space for basic movement, and architectural features that retained dignity and beauty despite their neglected condition. More practically, Eliza noted a small maintenance sink in one corner that appeared to have functioning plumbing, potentially providing access to water for essential needs. A series of built-in cabinets and equipment niches offered storage space for her limited belongings, while the room's elevated position relative to main drainage systems had kept it relatively dry compared to lower areas of the subway infrastructure. For the first time since the fire, Eliza felt a strange sense of possibility rather than progressive loss. The space she had accessed represented both immediate shelter and connection to her professional identity as someone who understood and appreciated architectural significance. While unconventional and temporary, The abandoned control room offered dignity that emergency shelters couldn't provide, along with security for her remaining photography equipment that would be essential for rebuilding her career. As Eliza carefully arranged her limited belongings in the space, she experienced a complex mixture of emotions: fear of discovery, balanced against relief at finding shelter; anxiety about the future tempered by satisfaction in successfully navigating a complex challenge. The control room was simultaneously a desperate last resort and an architectural treasure that aligned perfectly with her professional expertise and personal values. Most importantly, the space provided something beyond mere physical shelter. It offered temporary stability and psychological space to develop more sustainable long-term solutions. Instead of being forced immediately into an emergency shelter system that would compromise her ability to maintain employment and rebuild her career, Eliza had created a breathing space where she could continue working while pursuing legitimate housing opportunities from a position of relative stability rather than absolute crisis. The woman who had been overwhelmed by cascading losses suddenly found herself in a position to plan strategic recovery rather than merely reacting to progressive decline. The risk she had taken in accessing the abandoned station had provided not just physical shelter, but also restoration of agency, during a period when external circumstances had eliminated most possibilities for meaningful choice or positive change. Over the next 7 days, Eliza established a careful routine that balanced security concerns with essential needs, while gradually improving her temporary shelter in the abandoned control room. Each morning, she would leave before 5 a.m. timing her exit to coincide with the pre-dawn maintenance shifts when service doors were most likely to be accessed without observation. Her departures and returns required patience and precision, waiting for optimal moments when security personnel were focused elsewhere and maintenance crews were between shift changes. During daylight hours, Eliza maintained her part-time employment at the coffee shop and portrait studio, the regular income providing resources for basic necessities while maintaining appearance of normal daily routines. Her co-workers remained unaware of her housing situation, assuming she had found a shared apartment after her eviction notice. Eliza carefully maintained to avoid complications or well-meaning interventions that might compromise her temporary solution. Each evening, she would return to the abandoned station, following different routes to avoid establishing patterns that might attract attention, and carrying only essential supplies that wouldn't create suspicious bulk or weight in her backpack. The careful choreography of arrivals and departures required constant attention to security protocols and transit personnel movements, skills Eliza developed with surprising aptitude given her previous inexperience with such clandestine activities. The control room itself was gradually transformed through small, careful improvements that enhanced livability without creating obvious signs of human habitation. Eliza cleaned surfaces using minimal water and biodegradable products that left no chemical residue or scent that might alert maintenance workers. She arranged her sleeping area on a yoga mat, positioned behind an equipment cabinet, invisible from the doorway should anyone unexpectedly enter the space. Most significantly, Eliza discovered that the maintenance sink did indeed have functioning cold water, likely connected to auxiliary systems that maintained minimal pressure throughout the station infrastructure, even in abandoned sections. This discovery dramatically improved her ability to maintain basic hygiene and meet essential needs without relying exclusively on public facilities during daylight hours. By the end of the first week, the control room had become a functional, if unconventional, living space that provided genuine advantages over emergency shelter alternatives. The architectural beauty of the tile work and brass fixtures offered aesthetic comfort that standard homeless services couldn't provide, while the isolation from other desperate individuals created safety and security for both Eliza and her remaining photography equipment. Most importantly, the space provided consistency and stability that allowed Eliza to focus on rebuilding her career rather than merely surviving day-to-day crises. The control room's solid construction and heavy door eliminated the constant vigilance required in outdoor sleeping locations, allowing genuine rest that improved her functioning during work hours and application processes for legitimate housing opportunities. On the 8th day of her underground residence, Eliza was carefully documenting the control room's architectural details with her salvaged camera when she noticed something unusual about the wall behind a damaged electrical panel. The ceramic tiles showed subtle differences in pattern alignment compared to surrounding sections, suggesting possible modification or repair that differed from the original 1904 construction. Her photographer's eye for detail and pattern recognition had identified an anomaly that might have remained unnoticed by maintenance workers, focused on functional systems rather than architectural integrity. The irregular tile work covered an area approximately 3 feet square, with mortar lines that showed slight color variation from the surrounding sections, differences visible only under careful observation with proper lighting angles. Eliza's curiosity was professional rather than merely personal. Her architectural photography had often involved documenting restoration projects where hidden features were discovered behind modern modifications. The possibility of finding original elements that had been concealed during later renovations appealed to her documentation instincts, potentially providing material for rebuilding her portfolio with unique historical imagery. Using her headlamp to create optimal side lighting that would reveal surface irregularities, Eliza examined the section more carefully, finding that several tiles showed evidence of removal and replacement, using techniques that differed from the original installation methods. The pattern suggested deliberate concealment rather than routine repair, with the replacement work dating to a different period than the surrounding original construction. Her research on the subway system's history had mentioned that during Prohibition in 1920s, many underground spaces in New York had been utilized by bootleggers seeking secure locations for illegal alcohol distribution. The abandoned or low-traffic areas of the subway system had provided ideal infrastructure for smuggling operations, with their multiple access points and connection to both waterfront areas and upscale neighborhoods where demand for illegal spirits was highest. The historical possibility that the control room might have been repurposed during Prohibition aligned with the apparent age of the irregular tile work, which showed characteristics consistent with 1920s renovation techniques rather than the original 1904 construction or more modern repairs. The section's location behind electrical panels would have provided ideal concealment for illicit access or storage, hidden from routine inspection by both transit authorities and police during the height of enforcement efforts. Acting on professional curiosity rather than expectation of significant discovery, Eliza carefully examined the edges of the irregular section, finding subtle tool marks suggesting that the tiles had been designed for removal rather than permanent installation. Using her multi-tool's flat edge as an improvised pry bar, she gently applied pressure to the section's lower corner, expecting to find perhaps a small storage niche or access panel to mechanical systems. To her surprise, the entire tile section moved as a single unit, revealing that it had been constructed as a concealed door rather than merely irregular repair work. The panel was mounted on hidden hinges that had been carefully designed to remain invisible when closed, with counterweights that made the heavy ceramic section move with unexpected ease despite its substantial weight. As the panel swung outward, Eliza directed her headlamp into the revealed opening, expecting to find a small maintenance space or perhaps evidence of long-abandoned bootlegging operations. Instead, the light illuminated something far more substantial, the distinctive curved roof of a train car visible through an opening that connected to a maintenance siding completely separated from the main subway tunnels. The revelation was architectural rather than merely historical. The control room apparently concealed access to a storage tract that had been isolated from the main system during early modifications to the City Hall station. The hidden connection would have provided ideal infrastructure for Prohibition-era smuggling, allowing contraband to be moved through the subway system without passing through public areas or active platforms, where police presence was highest. Eliza carefully widened the panel opening, discovering a short access tunnel that connected directly to the maintenance siding where a single train car sat in apparently forgotten isolation. The car itself was immediately recognizable as a 1910s-era passenger car that had been converted for some alternative purpose, with its windows covered by metal panels and its original doors replaced with heavy loading hatches that would have allowed cargo transfer without exposing the interior to observation. The discovery represented a genuine historical find, an intact artifact from New York's Prohibition era that had somehow remained undocumented and undisturbed for nearly a century. The car's existence in this isolated siding raised fascinating questions about organized crime's utilization of transit infrastructure during the 1920s, potentially providing new perspectives on how bootlegging operations had leveraged public systems for private illegal enterprises. Approaching the car with both excitement and caution, Eliza documented its exterior with careful photography, using her headlamp to create optimal lighting that captured the vehicle's historical details and modifications. The car's exterior showed the distinctive craftsmanship of early 20th century industrial design, with cast iron details and riveted steel construction that reflected the quality standards of early subway manufacturing. The loading hatch on the car's side was secured with a padlock that had long since succumbed to corrosion, its mechanism frozen in position, but no longer functionally locking the access point. After photographing the original securing system, Eliza carefully tested the handle, finding that while stiff from decades without use, the mechanism still functioned when firm pressure was applied. The hatch swung outward with a low metallic groan, revealing an interior that had been comprehensively modified from its original passenger configuration. The seats had been removed entirely, replaced with custom storage systems that lined both sides of the car's interior. More surprisingly, the space showed evidence of having been sealed against environmental factors, with specialized insulation and moisture barriers that would have protected contents from the typical humidity and temperature fluctuations of underground spaces. But what truly took Eliza's breath away was the car's contents: dozens of wooden crates stacked in careful arrangements along both walls, their surfaces showing the distinctive branding of 1920s liquor distributors and international distilleries. The labels themselves were historical artifacts, featuring graphical styles and typography characteristic of premium spirits packaging during the Prohibition era, when branding was designed to convey authenticity and quality in a market rife with dangerous counterfeit products. Moving carefully through the narrow central aisle between the stacked crates, Eliza documented the car's contents with methodical photography, capturing both overall arrangements and detailed images of individual containers and labels. The preservation was remarkable. The car's specialized environmental sealing had apparently protected the contents from the degradation that would normally affect paper and wood in underground conditions, leaving labels and containers in near original condition despite nearly a century of abandonment. At the car's far end, a metal desk and filing cabinet suggested administrative functions beyond mere storage, perhaps record-keeping for distribution operations or accounting for the substantial revenues generated by high-volume bootlegging. The desk drawers contained additional historical treasures: ledger books recording deliveries and payments, correspondence between distributors and suppliers, and most remarkably, a leather-bound ledger detailing connections to prominent New York establishments and individuals who had received regular shipments during the height of Prohibition. The historical value of these documents was immediately apparent to Eliza. They provided unprecedented documentation of how bootlegging had functioned as a sophisticated business operation rather than merely. The ledgers revealed complex supply chains, financial arrangements, and social connections that linked international suppliers with local distributors and high-profile customers throughout New York society. But as Eliza continued exploring the car's interior, she discovered something even more extraordinary behind a false panel in the filing cabinet, metal strongbox that had been concealed within the administrative section. The box was substantial but not massive, approximately the size of a modern microwave oven, with an ornate combination lock mechanism that reflected high security standards of the 1920s banking industry. Unlike the car's entry padlock, this mechanism had been protected from environmental degradation by its position within the filing cabinet's sealed compartment, leaving it functionally intact despite decades without access. The combination dial moved smoothly under Eliza's careful testing, but without the correct sequence, the box remained securely locked against casual investigation. For several minutes, Eliza contemplated her discovery without attempting further access. The strongbox clearly contained something of significant value to the bootlegging operation, likely financial records, or perhaps currency that represented profits from illegal distribution. The historical significance was undeniable, regardless of the specific contents, providing tangible connection to a transformative period in American social and economic history. As a photographer specializing in architectural documentation, Eliza recognized the importance of proper historical preservation protocols. Unauthorized access to the strongbox might compromise its historical integrity or damage contents that deserved professional conservation. The ethical approach would involve notifying appropriate authorities and institutions that could properly document and preserve both the train car and its remarkable contents. Yet her precarious personal circumstances complicated the ethical calculation. As an unauthorized occupant of the abandoned station, revealing her discovery would necessarily expose her own illegal presence, potentially resulting in trespassing charges that would further damage her already challenged financial and housing prospects. The decision represented a genuine dilemma between historical responsibility and personal security. After careful consideration, Eliza decided on a compromise approach that would protect the discovery while seeking appropriate professional involvement. She would document everything thoroughly with her camera, creating comprehensive records that could guide official preservation efforts, while researching appropriate contacts at historical institutions who might approach the discovery with focus on its significance rather than punitive response to her unauthorized access. For the next 3 days, Eliza divided her time between work responsibilities and careful documentation of the bootlegger car and its contents. Her architectural photography skills proved perfectly suited for capturing the space's historical significance, with careful attention to lighting, composition, and detailed documentation that created museum-quality records of the unprecedented discovery. The photography process itself provided unexpected emotional benefits beyond mere documentation. For the first time since the fire, Eliza was engaged in meaningful professional work that utilized her specialized skills and expertise. The creative challenge of capturing difficult lighting conditions and complex historical details reconnected her with the artistic capabilities that had defined her professional identity before the disaster had stripped away her equipment and opportunities. Most significantly, the documentation project restored her sense of purpose and future orientation during a period when immediate survival needs had dominated her perspective. Instead of merely reacting to progressive crisis, she was creating something of genuine value, historical records that could contribute to understanding a significant period in American urban development and social history. By the end of the 3rd day, Eliza had compiled several hundred photographs documenting every significant aspect of the bootlegger car and its contents. The images ranged from wide contextual shots showing the car's position relative to the abandoned station, to macro-detail photographs of labels, documents, and manufacturing marks that established provenance and historical context for the artifacts. The completed documentation provided comprehensive records that could guide preservation efforts while establishing the discovery's significance, independent of her continued access to the physical location. This achievement created options that hadn't existed previously: the ability to share the discovery with appropriate authorities without necessarily exposing her own precarious housing situation. During her research into potential institutional contacts, Eliza identified Dr. Eleanor Hargrove at the New York Historical Society as particularly appropriate for initial outreach. Dr. Hargrove's published work focused on Prohibition-era urban infrastructure and organized crime, with particular emphasis on physical spaces and transportation systems utilized for illegal distribution networks. Her academic approach emphasized historical understanding rather than sensationalism, suggesting she might appreciate the discovery's significance while handling the complicated circumstances of its identification with appropriate sensitivity. Eliza composed a careful email to Dr. Hargrove, describing the bootlegger car and its contents with professional accuracy, while omitting specific details about her own housing situation or the exact method of discovery. She attached a selection of the most significant photographs as evidence of the find's authenticity and historical importance, offering to provide complete documentation and location information through appropriate channels that would protect both the discovery and those involved in its identification. The response came within hours. Dr. Hargrove's interest was immediate and enthusiastic, recognizing the unprecedented nature of finding an intact bootlegging operation with administrative records and potentially financial assets still in place. Her reply suggested a discreet meeting where Eliza could share additional information without triggering institutional processes that might create legal complications for either the discovery or its finder. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at a small coffee shop near Bryant Park, public enough for safety, but quiet enough for confidential conversation. Dr. Hargrove arrived precisely on time, her academic demeanor balanced by genuine excitement about the historical significance of what Eliza had documented in her photographs. "These images show something truly extraordinary," Dr. Hargrove explained after reviewing the complete documentation on Eliza's laptop. "We've had fragmentary evidence about how bootlegging operations utilize subway infrastructure, but nothing approaching this level of preservation or operational documentation. The business records alone would transform our understanding of how these networks functioned as economic entities rather than merely criminal enterprises." The historian's appreciation for the discovery's significance was evident in her careful questions about specific details and contextual elements that might help establish provenance and historical connections. Her approach was scholarly rather than judgmental, focused on historical value rather than circumstances of discovery that might raise complicated questions about access and authorization. Most encouragingly, Dr. Hargrove outlined potential approaches for proper preservation that might protect both the discovery and Eliza's interests. The Historical Society has established protocols for working with discoveries in sensitive circumstances, she explained. There are precedents for focusing on preservation and documentation rather than punitive responses, particularly when findings have substantial historical significance and have been properly reported rather than exploited for personal gain. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, developing into a detailed planning discussion about how the bootlegger car and its contents could be properly preserved while addressing the complicated circumstances of its discovery. Dr. Hargrove proposed a staged approach that would begin with a small team of trusted experts, conducting preliminary assessment and conservation before involving larger institutional resources and inevitable public interest. "The strongbox presents particular challenges," Dr. Hargrove noted toward the end of their discussion. "If it contains financial instruments or currency, as seems likely, That creates additional legal considerations regarding ownership and disposition. Historical artifacts with significant monetary value always involve complicated questions about appropriate institutional stewardship and potential claims from governmental authorities. As their meeting concluded, Dr. Hargrove made an unexpected proposal that reflected both professional integrity and human compassion. "I'd like to visit the site tomorrow with our senior conservator, just the two of us initially, to assess preservation requirements before developing more comprehensive documentation plans." The request represented both opportunity and risk for Eliza. Potential professional recognition for her discovery, balanced against exposure of her unauthorized residence in the abandoned station. After careful consideration, she agreed to the limited initial visit, recognizing that establishing relationship with legitimate historical authorities might ultimately provide better protection than continued secrecy and isolation. The following morning, Eliza met Dr. Hargrove and Dr. Marcus Chun, the Historical Society's head of conservation, at a small park near City Hall. Their approach was reassuringly discreet, no institutional vehicles or obvious equipment, just three professionals carrying ordinary backpacks and discussing architectural history with apparent casualness as they walked toward the Worth Street service entrance that Eliza had first used nearly 2 weeks earlier. Access proved unexpectedly straightforward with Dr. Hargrove's institutional credentials, which apparently authorized research access to historical transit infrastructure through agreements between the Historical Society and Metropolitan Transportation Authority. The documentation that had seemed deceptive when Eliza first glimpsed it being used by maintenance crews now facilitated legitimate entry for historical research purposes, transforming her furtive access route into authorized passage accompanied by recognized experts. Dr. Chun's reaction upon seeing the bootlegger car confirmed the discovery's significance beyond even Dr. Hargrove's enthusiastic assessment. "This is absolutely unprecedented," he whispered as his flashlight illuminated the car's interior for the first time. "We're looking at a completely intact Prohibition operation with its infrastructure, inventory, and administrative records still in place. Essentially a time capsule from one of the most transformative periods in American social and economic history." The conservator's preliminary assessment focused on environmental conditions and preservation requirements, identifying both challenges and opportunities for protecting the discovery. The car's isolated position had ironically created nearly ideal preservation conditions: stable temperature, controlled humidity, and protection from light exposure that would normally degrade organic materials like paper and wood over extended periods. The specialized insulation and sealing that the bootleggers installed to protect their inventory has essentially created a passive conservation environment, Dr. Chen explained as he carefully examined labels and documents. "These materials are in remarkable condition considering they've been here for nearly a century without active preservation measures." The conversation shifted to planning next steps for proper documentation and conservation, with both historians expressing clear preference for methodical assessment rather than rushed removal or public announcement. Their approach emphasized preservation of context rather than mere artifact collection, understanding how the entire operation had functioned rather than simply extracting valuable items for display or research. As the assessment continued, Dr. Hargrove addressed the complex situation regarding Eliza's discovery and current circumstances with unexpected directness. "Your documentation work here is genuinely valuable from a historical perspective," she noted while examining Eliza's photographs of the ledger books. "This level of careful recording shows professional understanding of architectural and historical documentation that museums and research institutions actively seek." The historian's comment created natural opening for Eliza to share more details about her professional background and the circumstances that had led to her current situation. The conversation evolved from purely historical assessment to broader discussion of how Eliza's expertise might connect with institutional needs for specialized documentation services, particularly for historical sites with challenging access or lighting conditions. Your documentation work shows exceptional technical skill and historical sensitivity. Dr. Hargrove continued, examining the photographs more carefully. The Historical Society frequently contracts with specialized photographers for difficult documentation projects, particularly for sites with challenging access or lighting conditions like abandoned infrastructure and historical interiors. Would you be interested in discussing potential project work once we've addressed the immediate priorities with this discovery? The question caught Eliza completely off guard, representing the first genuine professional opportunity that aligned with her expertise since the fire had destroyed her equipment and portfolio. The possibility of contract work with a respected cultural institution offered not just immediate income potential, but also rebuilding of professional credentials and portfolio that could support long-term career recovery. I would be very interested, she replied carefully, balancing enthusiasm against the obvious complications of her current circumstances. My equipment situation is limited at the moment, but documentation work is exactly the type of photography I specialized in before losing most of my gear in an apartment fire 6 months ago. Dr. Chun joined the conversation with unexpected practicality, addressing the equipment constraints directly. The Society maintains professional photography equipment for documentation projects, specialized lenses, lighting systems, and stabilization tools that contractors can access for institutional assignments. Many of our project photographers prefer using our gear for consistency across institutional archives. This pragmatic solution to what had seemed an insurmountable obstacle, the inability to replace expensive specialized equipment, opened possibilities that Eliza hadn't considered previously. Institutional contract work could provide access to professional tools without requiring immediate capital investment, allowing her to rebuild her portfolio and professional reputation while gradually replacing personal equipment as finances permitted. The discussion shifted to immediate next steps for the Bootlegger car preservation, with Dr. Hargrove proposing a formal documentation project that would employ Eliza as a contracted specialist working alongside the Historical Society's conservation team. The arrangement would provide legitimate income and professional credentials while addressing the discovery's preservation requirements through proper institutional channels. This find warrants comprehensive documentation before any decisions about physical preservation or potential relocation, Dr. Hargrove explained. We'd need several weeks of careful recording, detailed photography, measurement, condition assessment, and inventory documentation. Your familiarity with the site and documentation skills would be valuable assets for this initial phase. The proposal represented multiple intersecting opportunities: legitimate employment aligned with Eliza's professional expertise, institutional connection that could lead to additional contracts, and resolution of her unauthorized residence through conversion to legitimate site access for professional purposes. The potential transformation from trespasser to contracted specialist offered pathway to stability that hadn't existed the previous day. As they prepared to leave the site, Dr. Chun raised the question that had remained unaddressed throughout. Their assessment. What about the strongbox? Its contents could have significant historical importance beyond the monetary value, particularly if it contains financial records that document connections between bootlegging operations and legitimate businesses or political figures. Dr. Hargrove considered the question carefully before responding. We should document it thoroughly in its current location before attempting any access. The Historical Society has conservation specialists who can examine historical locking mechanisms. Without damage, they've worked with similar artifacts from bank vaults and commercial strongboxes of the same era. The decision prioritized historical preservation over immediate curiosity, reflecting professional standards that valued context and documentation over hasty exploration. This measured approach reinforced Eliza's confidence in the historians' integrity and commitment to proper historical processes rather than sensationalized discovery. 2 days later, Eliza signed a preliminary contract with the New York Historical Society for specialized photography services related to documentation of recently identified historical transit infrastructure with significant cultural artifacts. The carefully worded agreement provided legitimate income and professional credentials, while establishing formal relationship with a respected institution that could support long-term career rebuilding. The contract's initial phase covered 6 weeks of documentation work at the standard institutional rate of $65 per hour, generating potential income of approximately $15,600 that would transform Eliza's financial circumstances from desperate survival to modest stability. More significantly, the agreement included provisions for equipment access, institutional affiliation for site access purposes, and potential extension for additional preservation phases depending on findings during initial documentation. Hargrove had also arranged temporary housing through the Society's visiting researcher accommodations, small but private room in a building owned by the institution that normally hosted scholars conducting research in the housing arrangement provided legitimate residence without requiring security deposits or credit checks that would have been obstacles to conventional apartments, while its midtown location offered convenient access to both the documentation site and potential future employment opportunities. The combination of professional contract and temporary housing created foundation for stability that allowed Eliza to focus on rebuilding her career rather than merely surviving day-to-day crises. The institutional affiliation provided professional legitimacy that would help overcome the employment gaps created by the fire and subsequent financial collapse, while the specialized nature of the project aligned perfectly with her expertise in architectural and historical photography. Most significantly, the contract transformed Eliza's relationship to the bootlegger car discovery from potential liability to professional opportunity. What had begun as desperate seeking of unauthorized shelter had evolved into legitimate historical research with institutional support and professional recognition, a transformation that reflected both the value of her specialized skills and the potential for rebuilding after catastrophic disruption. The documentation project began the following Monday with a small team that balanced comprehensive expertise with discrete operation. Dr. Hargrove led the historical assessment. Dr. Chun supervised conservation protocols, and 2 additional specialists joined for specific technical aspects. Dr. Sarah Levinson, an archaeologist specializing in urban industrial sites, and James Moretti, a conservation engineer with expertise in early 20th century transportation systems. Eliza's role combined lead photography responsibilities with site familiarity that helped the team navigate the complicated access routes and spatial relationships of the abandoned station infrastructure. Her previous documentation provided initial reference materials that guided more comprehensive recording using the Society's professional equipment, camera systems with specialized lenses for architectural documentation, lighting equipment designed for archaeological recording and measurement, tools that created precise spatial documentation. The professional equipment transformed Eliza's capabilities, providing technical resources that exceeded even her pre-fire gear. The camera bodies offered resolution and low-light performance that captured details invisible to standard equipment, while the specialized architectural lenses corrected perspective distortion and maintained focus across complicated spatial planes that characterize the underground structures. Most importantly, working alongside established professionals restored Eliza's confidence in her expertise after months of diminishment through financial crisis and employment rejection. Her contributions to the documentation process were valued and incorporated into the team's methodologies, with Dr. Hargrove frequently consulting her regarding optimal recording approaches for complicated architectural features and lighting conditions. The documentation of the bootlegger car itself proceeded with meticulous attention to both historical significance and conservation requirements. Each artifact was photographed in its original position before careful recording of identifying details, manufacturing information, and condition assessment. The team created comprehensive inventory documentation that would support both historical research and potential future exhibition development, establishing clear provenance for each element within its operational context. The ledgers and administrative documents received particularly careful handling, with Dr. Levinson supervising proper conservation protocols for paper materials that had remained in remarkably good condition despite decades without active preservation measures. The financial records provided unprecedented documentation of how bootlegging had functioned as sophisticated business operation rather than merely criminal enterprise, with detailed accounting systems that tracked inventory, distribution, and revenue across complex supply networks. As the documentation progressed, the team uncovered evidence that the operation had connections to several prominent New York establishments that had continued operating throughout Prohibition despite alcohol restrictions. The delivery records identified speakeasies, hotels, and private clubs that had received regular shipments, with coded entries that Dr. Hargrove could correlate with known establishments from other historical sources. This documentation provides the missing links between production, distribution, and consumption that we've never had in such complete form, she explained during their third week of recording. We can trace specific shipments from distilleries through this distribution point to eventual delivery locations, essentially mapping the entire supply chain of illegal alcohol during one of America's most fascinating social experiments. The historical significance extended beyond mere documentation of illegal activities to broader understanding of how Prohibition had transformed American business practices, social behaviors, and relationship between legal frameworks and actual community practices. The records revealed sophisticated adaptation to regulatory constraints, with businesses developing parallel systems that maintained social and economic functions despite legal restrictions. During the fourth week of documentation, the team finally addressed the strongbox that had remained untouched during initial recording phases. Dr. Chun arranged for Sylvia Martinez, the Society's specialist in historical security systems, to examine the locking mechanism and assess options for non-destructive access that would preserve the box's historical integrity while allowing documentation of its contents. Martinez's examination revealed that the strongbox was a modular banking model from 1922, designed for financial institutions requiring highest security standards available during that period. The combination mechanism showed signs of deliberate modification that suggested customization by professional safecrackers working for bootlegging operations, likely adapting legitimate security systems for illegal enterprises with techniques developed during earlier criminal activities. This is actually historically significant in itself, Martinez explained as she documented the lock modifications. We're seeing evidence of how criminal enterprises adapted legitimate business tools for illegal operations, essentially parallel technological development that modified mainstream systems for alternative purposes. After thorough documentation of the external features and locking mechanism, Martinez attempted non-destructive access using techniques developed for museum conservation of similar historical security systems. The process required careful manipulation based on understanding of the mechanism's design principles rather than destructive forcing that would damage historical integrity. After nearly 3 hours of patient work, the lock finally yielded with a barely audible click that signaled successful non-destructive access. The team gathered around as Martinez carefully opened the strongbox for the first time in nearly a century, revealing contents that exceeded even their optimistic expectations regarding historical significance and preservation. The strongbox contained 3 distinct sections, each offering extraordinary historical documentation of Prohibition-era operations. The first compartment held financial records more detailed than the general ledgers found in the desk, showing specific payment amounts, banking connections, and investment structures that mapped the operation's financial architecture with unprecedented clarity. The second section contained legal documents including property deeds, business licenses for front operations, and most remarkably, evidence of protection arrangements with local officials who facilitated the bootlegging operations in exchange for regular payments. These records provided direct documentation of the corruption systems that had enabled illegal alcohol distribution throughout Prohibition, with specific names, payment amounts, and service arrangements clearly recorded. But it was the third compartment that literally took their breath away: stacks of currency and financial instruments that had remained sealed in the controlled environment of the strongbox for nearly a century. The cash consisted primarily of large denomination bills from the 1920s, while the securities included bearer bonds and investment certificates that represented significant wealth even during their original period. "This is absolutely unprecedented," Dr. Hargrove whispered as they carefully documented the financial cash. "We're looking at both the physical assets and the complete financial records of a major bootlegging operation, essentially the entire business infrastructure preserved." At the moment of apparent abandonment, the currency alone represented substantial value both as historical artifacts and as collectible numismatic items, with preliminary estimates suggesting worth exceeding $1.4 million for the rare large denomination bills that had become highly valued by collectors. The bearer bonds and securities added additional financial value while providing documentary evidence of how illegal proceeds had been converted to legitimate. The disaster that had initially appeared to eliminate her career had ultimately led to expanded professional opportunities and institutional connections that might never have developed through conventional career progression. As she concluded her presentation, Eliza offered reflection that resonated beyond her personal experience to broader understanding of how apparent disasters sometimes create unexpected opportunities for those willing to apply their expertise in unconventional contexts. "Sometimes our greatest professional contributions emerge from circumstances that initially appear to offer only limitation and loss," she observed. "The spaces and opportunities that others overlook or abandon may contain possibilities that become visible only when we apply our specialized knowledge with both technical skill and human curiosity." The exhibition opening marked both professional milestone and personal transformation, from desperate seeking of unauthorized shelter to recognized expert contributing to institutional understanding of American urban history. The journey had required courage, resilience, and willingness to pursue unconventional approaches when traditional systems proved inadequate for addressing immediate needs. Most importantly, Eliza's experience demonstrated how specialized expertise retains value even when conventional application seems temporarily impossible due to external circumstances or resource limitations. Her architectural knowledge and photographic skills had ultimately created not just personal recovery, but also institutional and historical benefits that extended far beyond individual circumstances to broader social and cultural understanding. The bootlegger car that had remained hidden for nearly a century had not only preserved remarkable historical artifacts but also created opportunity for someone with the expertise to recognize its significance and the professional skills to document its contents. The Prohibition-era entrepreneurs who had created the hidden storage system could never have anticipated how their concealed operation would eventually provide both historical insights and personal redemption for someone facing entirely different challenges nearly a century later. As Eliza moved through the exhibition space following her presentation, observing visitors engaging with the historical materials and her documentary photographs, she reflected on how completely her circumstances had transformed in just 3 months. The desperate woman who had risked trespassing charges to find shelter in an abandoned subway station was now a contracted specialist with multiple institutional affiliations, financial security, and growing professional recognition for her expertise in architectural documentation. The transformation hadn't erased the trauma of losing her home and equipment in the fire, but it had created new foundation for both professional practice and personal stability that honored her specialized knowledge, rather than requiring abandonment of hard-earned expertise. Instead of starting over in unrelated work, she had rebuilt within her field by applying her skills in contexts that recognized and valued her specific capabilities. Perhaps most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that even during periods of apparent decline and limitation, possibilities for meaningful contribution and personal recovery remain available for those willing to apply their expertise in unconventional ways. The specialized knowledge that seems irrelevant during crisis may ultimately provide pathways to recovery that honor both individual capabilities and broader social and cultural needs. The bootlegger fortune that had remained hidden for nearly a century had not only provided financial resources but also created opportunities for someone to apply specialized skills in ways that generated both personal recovery and institutional benefit. The discovery represented not just historical artifacts, but also the potential for finding unexpected value in overlooked spaces and forgotten infrastructure, a lesson in how apparent abandonment sometimes conceals remarkable possibility for those with the expertise to recognize significance beneath surface appearances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.